The Northeast Corridor. Many hear that name and it conjures the image of the high-speed electrified rail line that runs from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, New Haven, and Boston, or more broadly, the geographic region in Megalopolis that said rail line serves. However, the name Northeast Corridor perhaps accidentally serves to downplay the numerous other rail lines that connect to it, connecting to towns and cities far and wide. From the equally fast electrified Keystone Line from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, the busy Long Island Railroad network, which carries more passengers than any regional or commuter rail operator on the continent, the all-electrified S-Bahn-esque network that is SEPTA's regional rail in Philadelphia, the sprawling MBTA network serving Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and the expansive, near-statewide rail network of New Jersey Transit, to say nothing of all of the metro and light rail services that it connects with along its length. But while the Northeast Corridor and its many connecting lines serve many places far afield of its core trunk, from Atlantic City to Pittsburgh to Charlotte to Niagara Falls and even Toronto and Montreal, there's more than a few places that the corridor is missing connections to that are much closer to home. And while there are connections that are being considered for the near and far futures, there is one that not many people talk about. One that would connect the nation's capital and a state's largest city to its state capital. Perhaps an ideal commuter route to a place many consider to be one of the nation's most picturesque state capitals is sitting under our noses without much consideration. For a while, I've had this question poking and prodding in the back of my mind, and with a little video contest put out there by Classy Whale and Stormy Cara, I figured that it would be a great time to seriously think this over. What would it take to bring train service back to Annapolis, Maryland? Before I delve into things in earnest, I think it would be prudent to consider why I think Annapolis would be an ideal city to connect with a rail service. And for that, we need a bit of context. Annapolis is located on a small peninsula that reaches into Chesapeake Bay to its east, flanked by the Severn River to the north and the South River to the south. Go figure. With its somewhat constrained geography, Annapolis is rather dense, with a population of nearly 41,000 people and a density of around 5,500 people per square mile, outdoing a fair number of major cities across the country. Annapolis is well known for a few things. It is, of course, the state capital of Maryland, and it has been since 1694, when it was still the colonial province of Maryland. It's perhaps best known today as the home of the United States Naval Academy, the college for minting new officers in the U.S. Navy, akin to West Point for the Army, as well as being the home of St. John's College, a private liberal arts school. The town has a rich and colorful history, but the history buffs out there may know it best for the Annapolis Convention, which was a trade policy convention among the 13 states in 1786 that led to Alexander Hamilton to convince the delegates to push for a new constitution for the United States, replacing the failing Articles of Confederation, thus leading to the much more famous Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia the very next year, which created the United States Constitution and the US government that we know today. Alongside that, Annapolis is well known for its sailing culture, leading to one of its nicknames being the sailing capital of the world, with another nickname being Crabtown on the Bay, because as we all know, Maryland is legendary for its seafood, and especially Maryland crabs. Always a favorite of mine. Plus, on a personal level, I have family who live in the Annapolis area, including my sisters and their families, along with friends there as well. But aside from sentimentality, there's definitely more practical reasons as to why reviving rail service here should be considered. Broadly speaking, Washington, D.C.'s metro area is growing. In fact, it's one of the fastest growing regions in the whole country. Annapolis itself saw a population increase of over 6% in the past decade, and while that may not be as impressive as some parts of the D.C. area, it still is substantial. With this pattern seemingly unrelenting, extending rail connections into this underserved corner of Maryland could easily help to relieve traffic pressures on the area's highways, as well as serve as a potential catalyst to densify the areas around the supposed line, as has happened across the DMV, with stations around the DC Metro, MARC Commuter Rail, and Virginia Railway Express commuter rail services seeing substantial residential and commercial development in recent years and decades, which is only set to continue. Therefore, I would argue that in the long term, a high-capacity transit connection between DC and Annapolis, as well as Annapolis and Baltimore, would be a wise long-term investment. On top of that, it would be the next chapter in a region's fascinating history with rail, because for a substantial amount of the time that it had a rail service, Annapolis was not served by steam-powered trains as we think of, but instead by interurban trolley lines. Although the first railroad to reach Annapolis, the Annapolis and Elk Ridge Railroad, was indeed steam-powered, as it was opened in 1837 to connect to the Baltimore and Ohio's Washington branch, known today as the CSX Capital Subdivision, but perhaps best known as MARC's Camden Line, the line would eventually, after several bankruptcies, fall under the auspices not of the much larger B&O, but of an upstart interurban line, the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Electric Railway in 1902, which naturally electrified the line, and several others linking Annapolis to Washington and Baltimore, along with another line that directly connected Baltimore and Washington, running parallel to both the Baltimore and Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad's main lines between the two cities, the latter being the Northeast Corridor that we know today. Alongside that, the WB&A would also acquire the Baltimore and Annapolis Short Line Railroad, which provided a straight shot between the state capital and its largest city. While the lines quickly proved popular as a vital link between Annapolis and its surrounding cities, as well as its use by the cadets of the Naval Academy, helped further by the B&O being allowed to run freight trains on the line to service the town and the academy as well, the Great Depression would ultimately be its ruin, as was the case with many smaller and mid-sized interurbans, and the WB&A would officially end passenger service on August 20th, 1935. After that, the lines would stick around until as late as the 1980s, when the line was used for freight traffic by Conrail to service various military clients, until eventually ending in 1981, with most of the tracks being completely gone by 1989. Today, the only traces of the WB&A is the former Baltimore and Annapolis line, which is now the Baltimore and Annapolis Trail, heading as far to the northwest as Glen Burnie, where the last true remains of the old WB&A stand as the Glen Burnie branch of the Baltimore Light Rail Link, which runs from Glen Burnie and BWI Airport through Baltimore and all the way north to Hunt Valley and Cockeysville, 30 miles away from Glen Burnie. So, as one can imagine, rail transport has not been the foremost option for Annapolis residents for a long time, going on close to a century at this point, as amazing as it sounds, with those who wish to use the train to go elsewhere finding themselves to have to make a trip either to Baltimore Penn Station, BWI Airport Station, or New Carrollton Station to reach their intercity destinations, or perhaps just go directly to Washington, D.C. for points south and west, enduring the pain and suffering of the area's highways in the process. However, that's not to say that public transport is not an option for people commuting from Annapolis to D.C. and Baltimore, and MDOT-MTA, Maryland State Transit Authority, runs several commuter bus lines that provide that connection, and also serve to supplement Annapolis Transit and its bus lines that serve the city and local area. But given the ridiculous congestion that I tend to experience when traveling down this way from Philadelphia, taking the bus is perhaps less considered than it should, to say nothing of the capacity constraints buses possess compared to a rail line. To be fair, in each of the scenarios I present to you, the viewer, the buses would very definitely have a supplementary role to serve, serving places that would be inaccessible to the rail line that would be chosen for this link, or as more of a local service to the rail line's express. Now, wait a minute, Steve, why'd you say it like that? Well, my proposal is not merely one line that would be the empirically best option. My idea is a choice between one of three options to connect Annapolis by rail, since after pondering this idea long and hard, it's hard to be sure which one would be the absolute best. Though, full disclosure, I have a personal list of which I like the most and which I like the least. If you think any of the others are better than my favorite, you do you. In any case, let's start with my least favorite of the three options: extending the Metro Rail blue or silver line to Annapolis from Largo. This idea would see either the blue or silver lines, though most likely the silver line given WMATA's future ideas for the blue line, to reach Annapolis by first heading out of Largo and reaching the median for Maryland Route 214. And this part of the line would almost certainly be elevated due to Route 214's strode-like nature and to cross over freight rail tracks in the area. And it would do so after emerging from the tunnel that would inevitably run under Largo, which already exists in part where the tailing tracks for Largo Town Center Station run. Regardless, this line would have a station at Mitchellville, both to serve the people there and also the Six Flags amusement park in the area, before turning north to run in the median of Cairn Highway or US Route 301, either at grade or elevated, though most likely the latter. Along this stretch, there will be a stop serving Bowie before the line joins another highway, this time John Hanson Highway, or US Route 50. Remember this one, it'll pop up quite frequently. Here, I would have a station at the current Davidsonville Park and Ride, just off the highway, largely for the benefit of riders from nearby Crofton, before serving the final highway median stop in Parole before coming off the highway and approaching Annapolis. After touring around Annapolis for a possible spot for the station, while I would want the station as close as possible to the center of Annapolis, the State House, and the Naval Academy, I have no doubt that would be difficult to work out politically, let alone possible engineering challenges. So in my concept, the line goes underground under West Street, or Maryland Route 450, before ending at an underground station at Westgate Circle, less than a mile away from the State House in the middle of the city, with an ideal place perhaps being this vacant lot on West Street and Monticello Avenue just past the developments on nearby Park Place. This station would be envisioned as a station more for the people in Annapolis itself, with connections to local bus services, whereas the stop at Parole would be the park and ride style station to pick up passengers from the surrounding sprawl. And with regard to the former, all three proposals would very likely be deep bore tunnels, both for political and engineering reasons, since it would be underneath a historic city and does so near the coast, so water tables need to be factored in here. And speaking of which, let's talk about our connection north to Baltimore. With this and the next idea to talk about, the idea is fairly straightforward by comparison, and that would be an extension of the Baltimore Light Rail link along the Baltimore and Annapolis Trail, similar to the under construction Purple Line nearby, with stops at downtown Glen Burnie, Marley Station Mall, Pasadena, Severna Park, Severn View to serve Anne Arundel County Community College, and Winchester on the Severn before the line leaves the trail and follows Maryland Route 450 across the Severn River on a new parallel bridge before heading into town near the Naval Academy, likely resorting to street running at this point, to serve stops at the Naval Academy near the Alumni Center, and the final stop at the Navy Marine Corps Memorial Stadium. Now, the reason why I describe this idea as being my least favorite of the three has to do with the largely circuitous route of the Metro line that would need to be taken to reach Annapolis. With trying to be realistic regarding the politics and pricing of it all, trying to greenfield this line from Largo to Bowie would be questionable, due not only to a ton of suburbs that would be cut under or run over, but also because of a golf course that would stand in the way of several direct routes, which is why I would build a route out of Largo underground and make a turn under Largo and onto Route 214, with an added benefit of additional weekend and off-peak travel on the line to the nearby Six Flags amusement park. On top of that, with how ridiculous tunneling costs can be in the modern day, including for WMATA, highway median elevated or at-grade track would be ideal for as much of the route as possible, along with the added bonus of facilitating transit-oriented development wherever possible, particularly places like Davidsonville and Bowie, similar to what's being done around the stops of the REM in Montreal, and even other places served by the DC Metro. But for passengers traveling from places close to Annapolis to DC, this circuitous route that the line takes would slow the trip times and make the overall product less appealing. And this is to say nothing of the fact that it would be on the combined silver-blue line, or if the blue line loop concept, or bloop, ever comes to fruition, it would just be the silver line, which adds an extra layer of uncertainty about the reliability of service as it gets closer to DC. If this is built without the Blue Line loop being seriously planned, under construction, or operational, the Silver Line trains would have to worry about being interlined with Blue Line trains, thus hurting capacity for the service out of Annapolis. And one can argue that frequency this far out from DC shouldn't matter as much, and the worst that's being had right now on the core of the combined Silver, Blue, and Orange lines is a train every 15 minutes for each service, meaning a train every 5 minutes in the middle of DC off-peak, and that is a fair point. But investing this much in a rapid transit line usually comes with the expectation of as high a frequency as you can get, so the journey is done with as little thought as possible. Having to consult a schedule to ride rapid transit is infuriating, as anyone who rides the A train to the Rockaways can attest. Ultimately, this is an issue that I think the second option for this link resolves to a satisfactory degree, and that idea is extending the Orange Line from New Carrollton. New Carrollton Station has been the eastern terminus of the Orange Line from its opening date in 1978, and is easily one of the most understated transit links in the DC area. Not only does it serve the town itself of around 13,000 people, albeit largely as a park and ride historically, though with a fair amount of TOD that's been appearing around the station in recent years, and as stated is the terminus of the Orange Line and is a connection point to numerous local bus services, but right next to the metro station is the adjoined station for the Northeast Corridor, the first station on the line heading out of DC's Union Station in fact. A decent amount of Amtrak services, particularly Northeast Regionals, stop at New Carrollton, alongside commuter services running on the Mark Penn line to Baltimore and Perryville, and is also slated to be the future eastern terminus of the under-construction Purple Line light rail service between New Carrollton, College Park, Silver Spring, and Bethesda. Eventually, anyway. But in any case, the main reason why I like this idea more than extending the Silver Blue Line to Annapolis has largely to do with the more direct nature of the route, alongside the aforementioned connections. This is because the station is located right next to US Route 50, the same US Route 50 that runs directly from New Carrollton to Annapolis. I think you can see my thought process here. The idea in this case is to run the Orange Line in the median of Route 50, starting with an underground section immediately after New Carrollton Station and the maintenance yard there to pass under residential neighborhoods, with New Carrollton being a terminus point for some services still, and of course to serve the Orange Line's maintenance yard. From here, the line would emerge into and run along Route 50 to serve a stop at Fairwood before reaching Bowie and essentially following the same route from here as my proposed Silver Blue Line extension to Davidsonville, Parole, and eventually Annapolis itself. And in this scenario, the light rail route to Baltimore remains unchanged as well. Naturally, the more direct nature of this service would be a selling point for commuters from this region of DC compared to the Silver Blue Line idea. And the potential for higher frequency on this service and speed compared to the previous alternative, caused by the lack of a need for the service to share track with a completely different service, as is the case with the Silver Blue Line on the core of the network, could lead this alternative to attract more ridership, and once again spur transit-oriented development around the stations, particularly if we find ways to deviate off the highway to serve stations in the townships that they serve. The most obvious example here being Bowie, a city along Route 50 that's larger than Annapolis itself, with a population of 58,000, and therefore would be pretty obvious as a big ridership driver as Annapolis would be. Even more so with the potential transit-oriented development that could be built with the density and urban fabric to be attractive for more people in the region. And if the proposed Blue Line loop happens, which would see the Blue Line run through a separate tunnel from the Orange and Silver lines, this would be all the better, with less interlining and therefore more frequency of service. All told, this is definitely the preferred option I have with regard to the ideas involving WMATA's metro system. But while I definitely like this and the Silver Blue Line proposal in and of themselves, since I see it still retaining decent ridership regardless of it being less than optimal in my opinion with regards to trip times. But before we discuss my favorite option of the three, I'll address three other ideas that could possibly come up in discussion and all of which I have shot down and rejected. The first one is, but Steve, what about the green or yellow line? This would involve extending the Green Line to Annapolis from either end of its route, they being Greenbelt in the north and Branch Avenue to the south, or re-extending the Yellow Line to Annapolis via Greenbelt. Well, while the green and yellow line idea has less of an interlining problem compared with the orange, blue, silver line through DC, the problem with this idea is pretty self-evident. Both ends of the green line are oriented away from Annapolis. The southern end of the line is oriented more in the direction to the south, and therefore an extension to Camp Springs, Clinton, or Rosaryville would be more logical. And the northern end of the line to Greenbelt is oriented directly north, and the most logical extension there would either be to Laurel or Fort Meade. And while some people argue for the line to be extended all the way to BWI Airport, I think that's less likely than some ideas, but it's a heck of a lot more likely than directing a line that's mainly north-south oriented to suddenly split off to the east, likely going through greenfield trackage in order to get there, which makes not only this idea strange in context, but probably the most expensive of any option out there. The second one I've rejected is, but Steve, what about the purple line? This would be extending the purple line from its eastern terminus at New Carrollton along US 50. While it seems more attractive from a cost standpoint since it's light rail rather than heavy rail metro, this idea has 4 big problems that disqualify it immediately. 1. The purple line, when finished, will only run light rail vehicles that can only run in single-car formations, preventing active expansion of capacity on the day-to-day, thus capacity of the line would be significantly lower than any other option we put out here today. Second, the purple line would be noticeably slower. The top speed of the Purple Line's vehicles and trackage is limited to 55 miles an hour, whereas the DC Metro currently operates at 65 miles an hour, but is designed for operating speeds of 75 miles an hour. 10 to 20 miles an hour in speed benefit may not sound like much, but as anyone in the rail industry can tell you, higher speeds mean less bottlenecks, more capacity, and more efficient operations, alongside the fact that heavy rail metro eliminates the possibility of street running, which for a route like this aimed to be a high-capacity, high-speed service competing with a highway would be completely asinine, as it stunts the performance of the service. If the New York MTA of the current age is sensible enough to realize that street running is stupid and ruled it out for their crucial IBX project, then there is even less reason for entertaining the idea here. Thirdly, it's the Purple Line, a project that, while it is very good for its stated objective, and I personally like it, is riddled in controversy, is over 5 years late, and has become the poster child of the short-sightedness of private-public partnerships, and one that demonstrates why it's a good idea to bring as much experience as you can in-house, which in turn leads me to the problem of the Purple Line not actually being owned and operated by WMATA. It's owned by the state of Maryland, and M.MTA. And so far, M.MTA has shown less ability to deliver on projects compared to WMATA. And if the current laggard nature of planning for the Baltimore Red Line light rail project is any indicator, it has shown less inclination to obtain the knowledge to deliver these projects timely. I personally see WMATA and the agency responsible for my third idea to be far better suited to such a monumental project. Oh, and finally, the fourth one that kinda disqualifies it immediately. The Purple Line doesn't go to DC anyway, so passengers looking to go there, and that will be the majority, will be forced to transfer. Forever. Since light rail can't run on metro tracks and vice versa. Connections are nice, but one-seat rides are better to the average rider. Overall, this one was ruled out quickly. And finally, the third idea is, but Steve, why don't we create dedicated bus lanes on Route 50 so that the buses could run there without obstruction from Annapolis to DC or New Carrollton? That's not a bad idea in the short term, sure, but we're not looking at a short-term idea here. We're looking in the long term. Having a short-term solution be the long-term answer to a problem is stupidly endemic in our transportation planning, and it needs to stop. Also, Route 50 already has them, technically. It has HOV lanes for a decent amount of its length from Annapolis to DC, and it's safe to say that its effects have been limited. And finally, we get to my overall favorite idea for rail service to Annapolis, though one that may sound crazy when I first say it. The Annapolis diversion of the Northeast Corridor.
I'm sorry, what? Are you being serious?
Yes, I am serious.
Okay. Care to explain, please?
With pleasure. This would be a branch from the main Northeast Corridor running east from New Carrollton to Annapolis and then across the Severn River before heading along the peninsula before rejoining the main line just before BWI Airport. Now, this sounds crazy, I know, and I don't blame you, but I have my reasons for this that's not just wish casting. Because in the current day, this is the line with the lowest floor of the three. This one seems to be the one with the highest ceiling. But anyways, let's get into the details. After leaving New Carrollton Station going north, a flying junction would be built passing underneath the corridor and into a tunnel under the New Carrollton area before setting off down Route 50 as in the Orange Line Metro plan. Transitioning from median to the side of the highway, bright line style where applicable to maintain good line speed, a new station at Bowie would be built alongside park and rides at Fairwood and Davidsonville again before the Annapolis station. In this case, since I want the Annapolis station to be a through running station rather than a terminus, the line would still run underground into Annapolis station, likely in the same place. But pretty soon after, the tracks would curve away to the north rather than just end as tail tracks underneath the city, still running deep bored tunnel, because really that's the only way I see this working. After Annapolis, the line would cross the Severn River underneath it and pass under the Naval Academy too, which, if I'm being honest, hey, if they can have a railroad tunnel right underneath the Supreme Court building and the Library of Congress, there's little reason not to here, especially if it's deep bored tunnel. But anyways, the route would emerge back onto ground level before going onto a mix of ground level and elevated, paralleling Maryland Route 2, with stops in Arnold, Severna Park, and Pasadena before we reach the junction of Maryland Route 100 just south of Glen Burnie and close to BWI Airport. From there, there's really only two ways to deal with this, and neither of them are the most ideal if I'm honest. The first is directly following Route 100, which is a bit windy here as it goes past BWI, or just greenfield this part of the line, requiring property acquisition. But regardless, the end result is that this diversion rejoins the Northeast Corridor main line on a flying junction as it approaches BWI Airport Station from the south, and then onwards to Baltimore and beyond. And also in this scenario, I would extend the Baltimore light rail link at least to Pasadena to serve as a transfer point between the two routes, though having the light rail run all the way to Annapolis as in the previous two concepts would be the ideal, essentially being a local to the Annapolis Diversions Express service. Now, what's my reasoning for liking this idea above the Metro concepts? Well, there's several factors: speed, connections, and interoperability. But first, something to keep in mind. Considering the expense of this idea, this project would be a marquee project as part of a wider vision to expand and improve rail service along the Northeast Corridor and in Maryland more generally, one that would enable MARC, Amtrak, and freight operations all to prosper, and definitely something I want to talk about in the future of what just a system could look like. But for our purposes today, let's just focus on this, as it would be a crucial length of building such a network. Naturally, as MARC services go, this would be a secondary routing of their current Penn Line service, which as such would be fully electrified from day one. This will necessitate MARC getting over their current phobia of the electric locomotives that they already have, a phobia that they have for really stupid reasons that I will definitely talk about in future videos, and go even further than that, with the Penn Line, which I will note runs on entirely electrified right-of-way from DC to Perryville and will continue to do so with the planned extension to Newark, Delaware, needing to switch from mostly diesel locomotives and coaches to perhaps a stopgap of electric locomotives and coaches, likely with MARC buying up soon-to-be surplus ACS 64 units from Amtrak, and eventually to electric moldable units. Think something akin to the Alstom Multi-Level 3 EMUs for NJT or the Stadler Kisses on Caltrain, particularly if they want to stick with double-deckers for capacity reasons. In terms of speed, not only would the electric locomotives and especially the EMUs lead to improvements to the timetable in terms of acceleration and braking, as Caltrain has demonstrated with their KISS sets reducing journey times between San Fran and San Jose by over half an hour against the diesels without increasing the top speed of the line, no less. But with the aim of building this line as straight as possible, taking pages out of Brightline's book by building alongside the highway or in the median if space allows, could see the line run at a speed of around 100 to 125 miles an hour, utterly destroying the travel time between Annapolis and DC by car, and the metro as well, while also providing a connection within Annapolis itself in the form of the tunnel. This high speed would also be possible on the route between Annapolis and Baltimore, at least as far as the meeting of Route 100, where the line would likely have to slow down a bit before rejoining the Northeast Corridor near BWI before picking up speed again on the main line. And this also leads me to something to consider here as well: the upgrades that are planned for the Northeast Corridor itself right now, and the possible scheduling and ticketing patterns that it would entail. This deviation would allow Annapolis to not only be served by MARC commuter trains running at frequent intervals, but also select runnings of Amtrak's Northeast Regional service, and with the MARC trains serving as feeders to Amtrak services, as well as their role as a commuter service to DC and Baltimore, this would allow travelers from any station on the line to transfer with minimal hassle from a local service to an intercity service, which would make a trip from, let's say, Bowie all the way to New York City a straightforward affair, particularly with the envisioned frequency of the service, where with the use of EMUs and the proper sustainable funding for the state's rail network that such a program would entail, including bringing in and developing in-house departments to manage and work the infrastructure projects to reduce the cost, MARC services could service the lines multiple times an hour in this case, perhaps a train every half hour off-peak and every 15 minutes at peak times, combined with the capacity increases for the NEC itself that are envisioned via constant tension catenary, signaling upgrades, and reinstalling that fourth track on the corridor that was ripped out a long time ago, something I'll yell about in the future of course, along with building the new stations as 4-track passing loops where space allows to enable speed and flexibility, Shinkansen style, and this whole idea would likely be a smooth affair for most. And by the way, for some idea of what sort of thing may look like, or for a differing vision for DC's commuter network entirely, give a look at Dan Homonim's video for this contest after watching this one about his vision for DC's existing commuter network, which basically involves creating a quasi-intercity S-Bahn for the region. It's a cool idea and it's worth a look. Now, I am under no illusion that this is the most expensive idea in general, thanks to the heavy rail, high-speed nature of the line and the difficult tunneling process. But this one could actually be easier from a political standpoint, as both the metro extensions require Anne Arundel County, where Annapolis is, to join WMATA. And from my admittedly limited understanding of the politics on the ground from someone up north, the county is at worst ambivalent and at best apprehensive about that, since they still seem to have an independent attitude regarding its relationship with DC. This project, however, would make that issue non-existent, since it will be built by MDOT and, most importantly, Amtrak, in which the former is a state agency and the latter is national. All of them would be a tricky sell without some radical move to fund such a project, like paying for it with highway money or something to that effect, but one of them doesn't require as big a political minefield to be tiptoed through. Now, if there is a push for Anne Arundel County to join WMATA, I'd love to see it and I'd be all for it. But in the current situation, this could make things a little bit simpler. Naturally, from being around Philadelphia, I'm far from the most well-versed of the political realities on the ground in the area. So if anyone is, feel free to let me know, either here or on my Discord server. Shameless plug. And one last little note, there's something I ought to mention too. Future expansion potential. In particular, one idea I like for the future after this line is in place is to build a second tunnel going under the Chesapeake Bay from Annapolis to Kent Island and Queen Anne's County on the far shore, as a way to extend a possible rail service to the completely unserved eastern part of the state on the Delmarva Peninsula. This, alongside the proposed Amtrak route through Delaware between Wilmington and Salisbury, Maryland, as part of the Corridor ID project, could be the metaphorical bridge between running a train service between DC, Annapolis, and Baltimore all the way to the Delaware beaches and Ocean City. A nowhere near as frequent operation to be sure, but an extension of service between a major metro area and a series of beaches is sure to get people's attention. But that's a whole other discussion if I were to talk about that in full. And to say nothing of the fact that such an idea would take pressure off one of the most terrifying bridges to drive over in all of the country. If you know, you know. So, I know what some of you may be asking. What was the whole point of discussing this idea? Well, aside from the obvious fodder for what we in the transit community call crayoning, it's probably to get more people to think about ideas for transit, and particularly rail transit, that go beyond the obvious connections that either don't exist or already do, but with subpar service levels for the cities they serve. Now, obviously, those gaps need to be filled in first and foremost. In fact, I have 2 videos bringing up those obvious gaps in our national passenger rail network that are being actively researched and planned, thankfully. And I've got several more in the planning stages too. But it's worth taking a moment to think of the incredible potential that we truly have here. American passenger rail can be far more than just the obvious routes that are bound to see high ridership that we all know they can have, and only don't exist due to foolishness and inertia. There are plenty of other potential routes right under our noses that are there for the taking if we at the regional, state, and federal levels put together concerted efforts to build true cohesive visions for intercity, interstate, and regional rail travel. A route to Annapolis has always struck me as one such a route. One that goes pretty much unconsidered, but there are over 100,000 people in both Annapolis and Bowie alone, let alone the surrounding communities, that stand to benefit from such links to the outside world that involve more than just a car. While the visions I have for such an idea may sound fantastical, and perhaps they are to an extent, even if I try to ground my ideas in as much reality as possible, I would call it, and this video broadly, an appetizer of the kind of routes we can get if such a vision was made by state and federal agencies. This case regarding Annapolis may be an extreme example, hence my inevitable referencing of Jonathan Swift's satirical masterpiece, A Modest Proposal, in the title of this video, particularly since the old right-of-ways into Annapolis have been long gone. But it goes to show what can be done if one opens their minds beyond the obvious and looks ahead to what connections could exist. And to me, this one would also hold true to the state motto of Maryland, Fati Machi Parole Femine, strong deeds, gentle words. Actually getting to see Annapolis proper for the first time in a long time, taking in the sights and old world charm of the place, and being there with friends and family in the process, all the while going out there and riding the DC Metro, MARC, Amtrak, and even the Baltimore Light Rail Link during this time, really shows what can be possible too, and the kinds of people it can impact. This is certainly one part of a vision I have for the future of rail in Maryland and across the Northeast, and no doubt there are many others. But I think this whole experience reminds me that sometimes having a big outlandish vision could be the step in a long journey of reconnecting places that would love to have transit back, and would thus be the beginning of bringing tangible, positive change in so many places of how we get around.